Hey bead friends, it's Lauren, and today we are going to be taking all of the French beaded clematis components that we've been making for the last few weeks, and we're going to combine them together into a finished stem or finished vine, and then putting them in a vase or potting them. Okay, we're going to be starting with the little tendrils, the little curly Q viney bits that are sticking out of the plants. Now, I did make several plants without any of the little vines, so you definitely could leave these off if you don't want to have to deal with them. Okay, I am using an 18 gauge stem wire for mine, just because that's what I have on hand. I said 20 in the pattern because they're a little bit easier to mold into the curly Q, but I was out of those and all of the stores are too, so I'm just going to use this 18 gauge that I already have on hand. Now we're going to start with floral tape. We're going to cover the surface of our stem wire with floral tape. Floral tape is made to stick to itself, so you need to stretch the tape first. That's what activates the stickies. Don't forget the stretching part, and you'll need to stretch it as you go down while you're wrapping the stems as well. Alright, so I'm going to kind of go at an angle right at the top of my stem, and I'm going to attach the floral tape to itself on the other side, and then bend down the top. And I'm going to kind of squeeze at the top here, because I noticed that it's not really sticking very well. I'm kind of squeezing on top of that floral tape and then spinning the stem to get my floral tape to stick to it. Can be a little bit frustrating sometimes. And stretching the tape as I go and just spinning my stem at an angle, slight overlap so that the tape will stick to itself. And then just spinning and going all the way down to the end of my stem. I am leaving the full length. Mine is an 18-inch wire. Use the longest length that you can manage so that you have, we're actually going to be shortening this quite a bit when we do the curly Q. And you'll want to do, you'll still want enough stem wire left over at the end so that you have room in your arrangement to make length or, to place things. All right, now we are going to add the embroidery floss. Now, I did not floss all of my stems on all of my flowers, so if you are not wanting to floss the stems, I get it. It's very frustrating and annoying, and it does look prettier, but it also makes it harder to clean if it gets dusty. I'm actually going to cut several feet off of my skein because I do untwist my floss as I'm wrapping, and if it's still attached, then it's going to get super twisted on the other end. So having that open end makes it so that you have a way to actually untwist it. Okay, so we're going to put a little tail of the floss right against our stem and kind of pinch and hold that right at the top of the stem wire. We're going to be covering over that little tail as we go down to help secure it. And we're going to start carefully at the top, and I am untwisting my floss. I'm using just a regular 6-strand embroidery floss, and it comes kind of twisted. So you need to untwist it to make it flat first. And we're going to start carefully at the top there and wrap around. Now for the first several wraps, I do just move my arm around the stem, but once it's secure and you've wrapped over that tail several times, you can just kind of flip it and spin the stem wire. Make sure that you are untwisting your floss as you go, and also make sure that you're getting full coverage. So keep an eye on your floss. Make sure that the next little wrap of floss is directly beside the first one, so you get a nice even coverage. I'm going at a slight angle so I can wrap downward. Okay, so I wrapped down about halfway down my stem. That'll give me plenty of length to be able to make whatever size tendril I want, and then still have some room after to control the length of how far I want it to stick out from my flower stems. So you can go a little bit further if you want. It's not set in stone. Okay, so now I need to finish off my floss, and what I usually do is just kind of loop the end over the wire and then pull it through the little loop in my floss, and that'll make kind of a little knot there, and then I'm going to cut it short. Alright, now this next little bit, we need to be careful with the tip because we're going to wrap this into a little tendril. Now you can wrap it around an object if you want to. You can use your fingers. You can use the little handles on your wire cutters if you want to. I'm just going to use my finger because that's how I do things. So I'm just going to hold that tip very carefully. I don't want to push the floss off the end of my stem wire. And then I'm just going to carefully wrap it around my finger as many times as I feel is necessary, and then pull it off. Now, I don't want my curlicue to be perfectly shaped because that's not really how things grow in nature. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time and play with the exact shape and size of all the little curlies. I might make it a little bit tighter or a little bit wider. And then carefully shape that end. Maybe I'll poke that up a little bit. All right, so there is a little organically shaped little curlicue that I can add to my vines, and you can make as many of these as you want. The ones that I did put vines on, I did either 2 or 3 for each plant that I did. All right, now before we move on, I want to show you just another idea of how you can use these little curlicues, because it's a vine. They don't all grow exactly the same way. There's lots of different formations and variations that you can do. Now, this is something that I did. This is just a little photo frame vine that I did that I kind of wired to a photo frame. And what I did here, instead of having the curlicue separate, I kind of combined it together with a bud stem, which I'm going to show you here in just a little bit here. So instead of making a curlicue all by itself, I did the curlicue and then attached the leaf and buds to the curlicue rather than putting them on a separate stem. So that's just another idea that I wanted to throw out there. Next up, we're going to be assembling the leaf stems. Now what I've got here is an 18 gauge stem wire, which I have already covered in floral tape. That's just going to help make the surface be a little bit more grippy so that all of our components will stay in place a little bit better. I'm going to floss the stems here. You don't have to. You can assemble with floral tape instead if you prefer. And then I'm going to show you guys on the smaller leaf stems. So I've got a medium leaf in the lighter green color and 2 small leaves in the lighter green color. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to wrap our leaf stems with floral tape. We're going to do this for a couple of reasons. One, it does help make the stems a little bit more grippy so that they'll stay on your stem a little bit easier. It's easier to keep them in place. Also, we twisted our wire here below the leaf because that gives a little extra strength. It gives a little extra support to your leaf. But those twists do make some extra bumps, and if you put floral tape on it first, it does help smooth it out a little bit. Okay. So I'm actually going to cut some floral tape off of my little spool thing, my little roll, and I'm going to cut it in half lengthwise. This is going to make a thinner tape, and using a thinner tape for little tiny pieces like this helps reduce the bulk while still giving you that extra grip that you need. Okay, now I've got my thin floral tape, and just like before, I need to stretch the end. And I'm going to continue stretching as I'm wrapping down. So stretching the end activates the stickiness so that I can attach it to my leaf stems. Now this can be a little bit tricky to do. It can be a little frustrating as well because sometimes it does not want to stick to the top of your stem. So what we're going to do is I'm going to, again, just like we did with the stem wire, I'm going to wrap the floral tape around the stem right there at the top, and then try to attach it to itself on the opposite side. Mine is sticking pretty well. Sometimes it doesn't, so you need to kind of pinch a little bit harder, try stretching a little bit more. If it doesn't stick, you can also try flipping the tape over. Sometimes I feel like there's one side of this tape that's a little bit stickier than the other. All right, I'm going to pinch right here at the top and just kind of spin my leaf. I'm pinching pretty hard here to try and make sure that I've got a nice grip on that floral tape, make sure it's sticking together. And then I'm going to angle downward and wrap down the stem. Now you don't need to wrap all the way to the end of your wires. I'm just going to go about an inch or so below the leaf and then just tear the tape off. And you're going to need to do that to all of your leaves. Because our leaves stick out from the leaf stem a little bit, we need to floss part of the stem on our leaves first before we can assemble them into a stem. Now we are not going to wrap the stem wire on the leaf that's at the end of the wire because we will do that while we're assembling the stem. So if you're doing that's going to be the medium leaf in the lighter green color and then all of the large leaves in the darker green. So do not floss those ones. Medium leaves in light green and the larger leaves. Okay, so I'm just going to be flossing the 2 small leaves for this stem. And we're going to do that the same way we did with the little tendril. Just going to leave a little tail there. Little tail, pinch and hold right there at the top of the leaf. And then we're going to wrap downward over that little tail of floss. Now sometimes what I do, I've got a 6-strand embroidery floss here. Sometimes I actually divide that into 3 strands. It gives you a little bit more of a delicate wrap, a thinner stem, less bulk on your stem. but it does also take longer. So, all right, so I'm just going to floss down. I think that's about 1/2 inch there below my leaf stem, and then I'm going to tie it off the same way I did before. Cut this. Just kind of loop it around the stem, and then push the little tail up through that loop and pull. It'll give us a little knot there at the end of our stem wire. All right, so I've got both of my small leaves with the stem wrapped to about 1/2 inch below the stem, or below the leaf. And what we're going to do is we're going to add some little bends in the stem, kind of right above the end of our floss. I'm going to bend that one this way, and then bend that one this way. So now we're going to actually add the leaves to the stem wire, and again, we're going to be using floss for that. You can, of course, use floral tape if you prefer not to floss your stems. I'm going to cut a few feet of embroidery floss off of my little skein, and then take my little 18 gauge wire, which I've already wrapped with floral tape, and we're going to put the medium leaf right at the top, and we're going to make sure that that stem wire is about even with the bottom of the leaf. I'm going to add in my embroidery floss the same way before, kind of pinch and hold all of those stem wires and the little floss together. And then we're going to unwind or unwrap the, or untwist the floss, and we're going to wrap around. Make sure that you are right up at the top of that leaf so you don't have any of that stem wire exposed. Kind of doing this sideways so you can see that my stem wire is going to end up on the bottom of my leaf, because you get this little, I don't know what to call that, little sticky outy part of the stem there, and it hides a little bit better if you put it underneath the leaf rather than on top. So I'm going to floss down a couple of inches here. Once you get it secure, then you can kind of flip your stem over and just spin it. Now, do you notice here my little stem wires in my leaf? I don't know if I mentioned this before in the leaf video, I can't remember, but I have my little leaf wires are cut at different lengths. That way they'll end at different spots along the leaf stem instead of both dropping off at the same spot. I'm going to go down a couple inches below that medium leaf, and now we're going to add in the 2 smaller size leaves. So we can do this one at a time or kind of both together. I'm going to add in one and then wrap once, and then I'm going to carefully add in the other one. And I'm not really letting go of the first one. I'm just kind of sliding it in, because this leaf really isn't secure yet. All right. And then I'm just going to continue wrapping down. And then once both of those leaves feel fairly secure and like they're not going to fall off, then I can flip it and just spin my stem. Okay, so I've wrapped my floss several inches, I don't know how long that is, maybe 6-7 inches below my leaves. That's just going to give me a little bit of flexibility in the length of my leaf stems and my final assembly. So you can go down further if you want to, or you can go out a little bit shorter, but that's just going to give me some options while I'm assembling my vine. All right, so here is the finished small leaf stem, and then I also made a larger one that uses 1 large leaf at the end and then 2 medium leaves made in the darker green below it. Now, I've used 2 different greens here. You don't have to. For my white ones, I used just 1 color green for all of the leaves, and that made it a little bit easier to assemble my branches so I didn't have to match my colors together. Now, the reason why I do, sometimes in my arrangements, I use a lighter green for some of the smaller leaves is because it makes it look like those leaves are a little bit younger. This is a younger stem, and that's why I put all light green on this stem. And this, of course, would be older leaves that have been around a little bit longer, so they are a darker green. Now, there's going to be 1 small leaf stem for each size flower and 1 large stem for each size flower. So if you're making the full arrangement with 2 small flowers and 1 large flower, you should have 3 of these small leaf stems and 3 of these large leaf stems. You should still have some leaves left over, which we're going to be using for the bud stems, which I'm going to show you next. First, we're going to turn these little bud petals into a little bud. If you have a pair of pliers, it's going to make it a little bit easier, so go grab those if you have them. All right, we should have 3 bud petals for each bud. And what we're going to do is we're going to bend these top wires towards the back at about a 90-degree angle. Do that on all of your bud stems, bud petals. All And we're going to take all of our little bud petals and we're going to put the top wires together right in the center. Kind of match up those tips as closely as you can. So push those tips tight and close together, as tight as you can. There are 3 of them, so it can be a little bit difficult to hold. And what I kind of do is just put my thumb underneath where the tips are and then have my fingers hold tight onto those little petals. Now we're going to need to twist all these wires together, and we want them to be really tight and close together, especially where the tips meet. That way we don't end up with very much of a gap there at the tip. So I'm going to use my pliers so I get a nice tight twist right there at the top. Now be careful you don't break your wires. And then I'm going to continue twisting down at least a good 1/4 of an inch or so, just so I've got a nice secure join on all of those little wires so they won't come apart. Okay, let me see how good a job I did there. All right, that's pretty good. Now I'm going to cut this little thing short. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to push my thumb right into the bottom of these little leaf petals, and that's going to make a little bit of a bend there at the bottom, kind of a bowl shape to the bottom of those petals. We'll do that to all of them. And we're going to fold these little petals down together so that their bases touch, and so that little twisted wire kind of gets tucked away inside the bud. Now these buds are probably going to take a little bit of molding. Kind of pinch at the tip there, make sure I've got those tips all nice and close together. And might take a little bit of molding to make sure you don't have any awkward gaps between the bud petal units. Okay. All right, so spend a little bit of time molding your petals so that they sit nicely together. And then we're going to twist all of these wires together below. So very gently hold your bud. And we're going to try and make this twist as smooth as we can so we don't get a lot of lumps in our stem wire. And we're going to do that by first straightening out all the wires and then grabbing a little bit further below and then very gently twisting the length between. All right. Now, if you do need to kind of reshape your bud petals after you twisted this wire together, you can kind of insert a little stem wire or something inside there to help you reshape. All right, I think I've got most of my little gaps closed there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this little stem with embroidery floss and floral tape. So floral tape first, because that will help to smooth out the stem, but also add a little bit more grip. Got these little strings. Okay, so just like we did the leaf stems, stretch the end of the tape. I'm using a half-width tape here. Stretch the tape attached to itself on the other side. Squeeze right there at the top while you spin to try and get a nice tight fit on that floral tape. And then spin, and we're going to go down probably a couple inches here. That will give us some flexibility with our buds, how long we want our buds to stick out. After you wrap with the floral tape, then you'll just floss down at least a couple of inches below the bud. To assemble the bud stem, we're going to start out just like we did with the small leaf stem. I've got a medium leaf and 2 small leaves in the lighter green color. And then somewhere along the stem, we're going to add in a bud. It doesn't really matter if you add it up closer to the top or down below the small leaves, but I'm going to add this one in right below my small leaves. All right, so I want the bud to stick out a little ways, so I'm going to give it a couple of inches there between my bud and the stem, and then I'm just going to use my floss to attach it in just like I did the leaves. Alright, so I flossed down below that bud several inches there, probably 4 or 5 inches there, just to give me some flexibility as to how long I can make this stem on my finished vine. I want to go through and talk a little bit about shaping before we get into too far into the assembly process. Now, shaping is basically molding all of your components and your stems so that they look a little bit more natural. This is a process that I do in several stages while I'm assembling a flower. Generally, I do a little bit You'll see during the flower, I do a little bit before I assemble the flower, and then I do a little bit after I assemble the flower, and then I do more after I've put the vine together. So just to start out with some basic shaping for these vines, it's a little bit too straight. I'm going to give it some little bends and some curves into it, just a little bit more of organic shape. And my leaves are a little bit too flat. So I'm going to come in and bend them, mold them into different shapes so that they aren't flat and lifeless. Okay, so I can go ahead and add a little bit of shaping to it now, and then later while I'm assembling my vine or after I assemble my vine, I can kind of fine tune my shaping a little bit more. If you made the full arrangement that I did, you should have 2 of these bud stems. All right, now it's time to assemble the flowers. So I'm making a 6-petaled variety, and I've got my large petals here. So I've got 6 large petals. I've got my stamen, which I put together in the stamen video. And I'm going to be using a 30 gauge wire. I'm using a different color so you can see a little bit more easily what I'm doing on screen, but you can use any color 30, 32 gauge wire to assemble the flowers. I would probably use the petal lacing wire just because you already have it. It's going to get covered up, so it doesn't really matter what color it is. And we're going to need for the large flower, I use a 16 gauge wire, a 16 gauge stem wire, which I've already got wrapped in floral tape. If you're making the size 15 version, you're going to be using an 18 gauge stem wire. Those flowers are lighter and smaller, so you can use a thinner wire. You could probably use an 18 gauge wire for the small flowers in the size 11 bead version. I'm not sure I would for the large flower. You could try it because it's a vine and we're combining lots of stems together. It might work out just fine to use an 18 gauge stem wire for that one. So I mentioned that I've already got my stem wire wrapped in floral tape. Now in the PDF, it does tell you to wrap your petal stem wires and everything with the half-width floral tape like we did for the leaves. I'm going to recommend that you try it without that first. That does add a little extra bulk to your stems. But if you are struggling to get your petals to stay in place with your assembly wire alone, try wrapping those stems with the floral tape first, and that should give you a little bit extra grip. But at least try it without first. I mentioned before that I do the shaping or the molding of all of my components kind of in stages. A little bit before I assemble, a little bit after I assemble, a little bit after I arrange. Okay, so we're going to start shaping our petals now before we put them on our stem. And we're going to do that by grabbing the bottoms of our petals and just kind of pinching the bottoms in, and that's going to give us a little bit more of a 3-dimensional shape. That's all we need to do now before we assemble. So it's a little bit hard to get to those bottoms after we put our flowers together. If your petals didn't get as pointy while you were making those 45-degree angle wraps, then doing this little shaping here is going to help make it look a little bit more pointy. All right. I'm also going to bend all of my petal wires kind of at a 90-degree down right below the last row of beads. All right. Now we're ready to assemble. I'm going to cut several feet, probably just 2 feet. Is probably fine, of this 30 gauge wire off of my spool. And I'm going to be using this wire to bind all of my pieces to my stem. We're going to start in the very middle of the flower using the stamen. And I'm going to take the very end of my stem wire and I'm going to put it up into the stamen as far as I can go. Rather than just sitting below the stamen, I'm going to try and go inside. It gives a little bit more support to the stamen. And just like the floss, we're going to need to leave a little tail of the assembly wire and kind of press that against the stem. And I'm going to use my thumb to pinch that assembly wire right up at the top, right below my stamen, so that when I start my wraps are going to start up high. Tightly wrap that assembly wire 3 or 4 times, really nice and tight, and try and keep those wraps really tight and close together. Don't go too far down your stem. So they're really tight and close together right there underneath my stamen. And now we can start adding in the petals. Now I'm going to try and add in 2 at a time. If that's difficult for you, then just add in 1 at a time. So I'm going to do 1 and 2 petals right beside each other, and I am pinching and holding all of those stem wires together with my fingers, and I'm not going to let go until everything is secure. So I'm going to take my assembly wire, and I'm going to wrap right below those petals. I'm just going right above, right where I did that working wire tie off. So right above those petals, and I'm going to wrap a good 3 times to try and keep those nice and tight. And I'm not going to let go of those petals, and I'm just going to add in more. I'm going to add in 1, 2 more petals. And then again, I'm going to wrap 1, 2, 3. This time I did have to go a little bit lower underneath those petals, but try and keep your wire up as high as you can. 1 more time just for a little extra peace of mind. Not letting go, I'm just going to slide in a couple of extra petals. And then again, wrap 1, 2, 3, 4. And since these are the last petals that I'm adding on, I am going to continue wrapping that assembly wire down, and I still have not let go of any of these stem wires because they are not completely secure until you are done. So I'm going to continue wrapping this 30 gauge wire down, probably at least an inch below my flower, but if you feel like yours are secure before then, you can stop earlier. Alright, now to tie off the assembly wire, what I usually do is I lift up one of these little stem wires off of my petals, and then I wrap the assembly wire once around that petal, or that wire, and then push it back down, and then I can cut off right there, and my working wire is secure. Alright, now I've got all of these little stem wires, and I'm going to trim them to different lengths, so I'm going to try and pull them out. Some of them already are different lengths, which is helpful. I'm going to try and cut some of them a little bit shorter. I don't want them to all end in the same spot. This is going to help me to taper my stem down so that it gradually gets thinner as we go down rather than all at once. Gives you a little bit of a smoother looking stem. Alright, now I'm going to cover this full length with floral tape. That's going to help to cover the wires so they aren't exposed, but also to help smooth it out because we are going to floss afterwards. If I floss directly on top of this, it would be kind of a yucky looking flossing. So I'm going to take my floral tape. I'm not going to cut it in half this time as I don't really need to reduce bulk, and I do need some pretty good coverage here. I'm going to attach my floral tape as high up underneath that flower as I can. Make sure you stretch the end to make it sticky. And try and stick it to itself on the other side of the flower. You might need to that's not sticking very well. Let's try again. Okay. Pinch and grab right there and spin a little bit. Kind of use your thumb to help hold that floral tape up high. And pinch and spin. Trying to get up as high underneath that flower as I can. And once I'm satisfied with that, I can continue down my stem. I'm going to make sure that none of these little stem wires here are spinning and wrapping around my stem. So I'm going to try, I usually kind of hold like this so I don't touch them quite as much. See how that stem wire is slowly getting thinner, which is exactly what you want. I'm going to continue down a little ways there. You know, I just discovered that my flower, I accidentally put it on an 18 gauge stem wire. So I've got a large flower on an 18 gauge stem wire, and it's working pretty well here. It's not as stiff as the 16 gauge stem wire would be, but it is adequately holding it up, especially for a vine that has pretty delicate stem wires. It's holding it pretty well. So if you're going to be using a trellis especially to help hold up your flowers, you probably could just put that large flower on an 18 gauge stem wire. That would help reduce any of the bulk from having a lot of stem wires combining together. Okay, so I'm going to be doing this a little bit differently than what is shown in the PDF. The PDF has you go ahead and attach flowers while you're leaves while you're flossing down the stem. That's what I do in the PDF. And if you want to do that, you definitely can. It's not a big deal. But in this one, I'm going to do a little bit differently. I'm going to be planning out my vine first. It'll give me a little bit more flexibility. And then attaching my leaves during the final vine assembly instead of the flower stem assembly. All right, now I'm only going to be flossing down a couple of inches below the flower before the final vine assembly. But we need to attach this floss directly below the flower head. And what happens is that this flower head right below is a little bit thick, and so it can be a little bit tricky to do. If you need to, you can actually wrap this floss around one of the flower stems, which is what I'm going to do. Right, tuck it right in there around that flower stem. Try to get underneath all those beads. That will help to hold the top of the floss in place so that it's not going to slip around on you as much. And then I'm going to start flossing down. Now, because our stem wire is thicker at the top than it is going down, it can be a little bit tricky to get your floss to stay in place. But it just takes a little bit of patience. And what I do is I put my thumb on the back of the floss, on the back of my stem to hold that floss that I've already done in place, and then wrap again. And then again, hold that floss in place with my finger. All right, so I'm getting to a point where it's a little bit smoother and less thick. So I could probably just flip and spin now. Don't like that wrap. I'm going to redo it. And I did cut several, I don't think I mentioned this. I cut several feet, probably 3 or 4 feet of this floss off of my skein first. I don't need all of that for this flower, but I'll use the excess on the other flowers. All right, so I flossed several inches below my flower, and I'm just going to tie off the end of my floss just like I did before. Get a loop, put the end through the loop, pull it tight. I mentioned before that I do shaping in stages. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit now. So what I'm going to do is all of my flowers are kind of even and straight across. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a finger right at the base of one of my petals and kind of push down a little bit on the base. That might undo the shaping I did before, but that is okay. Push it down. Then I've got one petal that's kind of sinking lower. It's a little bit more of a natural shape there. And I'm going to take the very end of my petal and kind of bend it. This is where that lacing really comes in handy. If you didn't do that lacing, you have to be a little bit more careful with how you're shaping and bending all of your petals. Now, I don't want all of my petals shaped exactly the same because that's not natural. So over here, maybe I'm going to curl it up. And let's see, let's pull this petal down so it's not at the same level, sticking out a little bit differently. Gives you a little bit more dimension to your flower. Like this. Pinching that bottom again to fix that bottom. And let's see. I think I might leave the other petals just the way they are for now. I can always come back later and adjust it after I've assembled my vine and looking at my finished arrangement. Okay, so that was the large flower, and you'll need to repeat the process for the small flowers. All right, guys, we're in the home stretch now. It is time to take all of our little stems and combine them together into a vine that we can display either in a vase or in a pot. I've got 3 small leaf stems, 3 large leaf stems, 2 little bud stems, 2 small flowers, 1 large flower, and 2 little tendrils. Now I'm going to combine these together with embroidery floss again because I've already flossed all of these stems. So I'm going to be combining this stem together with embroidery floss. But you can, if you skipped embroidery floss on all of your other little stems, you can just combine it with floral tape as well. Before we start putting our vine together, I'm going to recommend that you do a layout, kind of plan what you want your vine to look like. And to do this, you need to kind of keep in mind how you're going to be displaying the finished vine. Are you putting it on a trellis? Are you putting it in a vase? If you're doing a vase, I'm going to recommend that you do a vine that kind of splays outward rather than a long, tall, skinny one like this. As in a vase, it's going to be a little bit harder to keep that a tall stem steady. All right, so if you have this, I usually do kind of a little triangular shape. All the ones that I put in my vases, I did a triangular shape, just to kind of help balance out the weight to make it a little bit easier to stand up in your vase. If you're doing it on a trellis, then you can do either the long skinny vine or the outward splaying vine like I showed before. And it all just depends on what shape that your trellis is. I had 2 that I put on a trellis. One of them was a little bit kind of a rectangular shaped grid type trellis. And that one I did have to do the outward splaying one just because it wasn't tall enough to do a long skinny vine. And also because I wanted good coverage of my trellis, I didn't really want a whole lot of bare trellis. So I did have to kind of splay outward and upward a little bit, keeping in mind the height of my trellis. For my little pink one that I made in size 15 seed beads, this trellis was kind of an art shape, and I really liked this one. This one's kind of one of my favorites of the ones that I've made so far. And this trellis worked better with the long skinny type vine. Because there wasn't, if I had done the wider vine, I wouldn't have had anything for these little outward stems to attach to. So for that one, I did do the long skinny vine, and they are symboled a little bit differently. I'm going to be doing the outward splaying one out here on camera just because I've already cut off, this is a stem I've already assembled and took apart to reassemble on video. And I've already cut all of my stems, and they're a little bit too short now to do the really long, tall one. So I'm going to show the outward splaying one here on the video. But just to walk you through, let's go over first the layout, and then I'll walk you through the difference in the assemblies. Okay, so basically to do a layout, you'll decide where you want each of your flowers. Usually I put the larger flower near the bottom just due to weight again. Not just physical weight, but also visual weight. I like having smaller things up at the top and bigger things at the bottom. It's just more visually appealing to me personally, but you do whatever you think looks best. And to do a layout, you're basically just going to take all of your little pieces and lay them on top where you think it would look good. So maybe we'll put a little bud coming out of the top here. Let's scoot this down. I'm doing a long skinny layout here, so if I did little bud sticking out of the top, and let's see, where should my other bud go? Let's put it down here by this big flower. And then I'll add in all of my leaves. I'm going to try and make sure I don't end up with all my light green leaves on one side and then my dark green leaves on the other side. That might look a little silly. And for these long skinny vines, you'll want to keep everything a little bit shorter. The individual stems on your stems kind of more compact and closer into the main stem. Okay, so this is kind of a layout for a long skinny type vine where we have basically one central stem. And the way that you're going to assemble this vine that makes it different than what I'm going to show you here in this demo is that you'll start at the top and work your way down, adding in one little stem at a time, all in one long continuous length. Okay, so let's say I want to do I need a wider vine for whatever I'm doing. Okay, so I've got kind of a triangular shape here, and I've got some offshoots from the main vine. So there's going to be one tall vine and then several smaller vines sticking out. So let's put a bud that'll come off of this flower. And let's do a bud with a little tendril up here. And then let's see, I need some leaf stems. So this flower's got some leaf stems there. And then I'm going to have the tendril kind of shoot off from there-ish. And let's see, this flower needs some leaves. So let's add in some leaves down here. I'm doing one of each size to each flower. Okay, so this is more of a layout for a wide vine. If you notice, I've kind of got them in little clusters because that's how I'm going to assemble this one. I'm going to first assemble all the little offshoot vines. So I will take this over here and assemble this little vine. And then I'll take this part up here and assemble this little vine. And then take this part and assemble this little vine, and then combine them all together in the center. All right, so that's how the assembly is going to be different for the different types of vines. So I'm going to go with this layout here on camera. So I'm going to kind of move my little bunches separately. Now I'm going to do the lower ones first, and then the tall one, the upper one. Okay, so let's start with this one. And basically the assembly is generally the same as what we've been doing this whole time. I'm going to use floss. I'm going to combine all these little things together. Now, if you have any difficulty getting the floss to hold your things still, you can combine them with floral tape first and then floss. And if you're having an extra hard time getting all your little things to stay together, you could bind them together with wire and then cover with floral tape and then cover with floss. So I'm going to start at the end of this little vine. I'm going to take this bud first and then attach the flower to it. I'm doing this a little bit differently than what I did in the PDF. The PDF I added the leaves onto each of the flowers first and then added the little ends together. You can do either. It's not really that big of a deal, but this time I'm going to start with the end first and then combine as I go down. So I'm going to hold those stems together. And what you can do is kind of attach the embroidery floss to one stem first, if that helps hold that tail in place. And then add in the next stem. And we're just going to wrap them together with that with the embroidery floss like we've been doing this whole time. Now, if you have those little knots down at the bottom of your stem where we tied off those little pieces of embroidery floss, those are a little bit harder to cover. And sometimes if you kind of squeeze them and flatten them first, they're a little bit easier to get over. And I kind of do this rotation with my wrist, and that helps prevent my floss from getting tangled up in the stuff. So I've got a few little thingies there. I'm going to add in a leaf stem now. Now I'm able to keep a really tight grip on my stems, and that kind of is helping them to stop from spinning around while I'm assembling. If you can't keep this grip on your stems that keeps them from spinning, then try the floral tape first. Try to floral tape it and then wrap it with embroidery floss. So I'm going to go down a couple inches here and then add in this other little leaf stem. Alright, I'm going to add in this last leaf stem. This one I didn't floss down very far, so I don't have as many options as to how long I'm going to make it. Now, when you're adding in your leaf stems, remember that leaves do shoot out of all sides of the vine. They don't just come out of the front or the left or the right. Sometimes you can put them on the back too, and that give you a more dimensional looking branch. Alright, so I've got one little section of my vine finished. I just flossed down a couple inches below that last leaf there. That's not gonna, I don't need as much of a length there, so just floss down a couple inches below that last leaf, and then kind of leave the rest of your stems separated like that. I'm gonna complete this process on my other little sections of my vine as well, and it's done exactly the same way. So I'm gonna go do that, and I'll be right back. Alright, so I've got 4 little different sections to my vine that I've made and put together, little offshoots from the main vine. And I've still got my floss attached to the one that I have at the top. I did not tie off that floss because I'm going to use that floss to continue downward and attach all these vines together in the center. Okay, so let me show you my little individual sections here. I've got a flower with a little tendril and some leaves. This is that first one I showed you with the bud and the flower and the leaves. And then I've got a bud with a tendril. And then this top one just has the flower and the leaves. And then I'm going to continue downward with this floss to add in all of my pieces one at a time. I'm going to combine these together right about there. Okay, I'm trying to decide how far I need to floss down, and to do that I'm just going to lay my little branch sections together and kind of figure out, okay, I need to floss down about to here on my main stem before I add in this second one. Or do I want this one up higher? No. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to floss down to about here-ish and then add in this little side vine. Okay, this one, because of its shape, I'm a little bit, in the weight distribution, I'm a little bit easier to just kind of flip it over and spin, and that's going to help me go a little bit faster. Alright, so I've got to join in this last stem, and I need to use a new length of floss to do that, and that's pretty easy to just join in a new thread. At the joint is the easiest place to do that, and I'm just going to wrap the thread a couple times around the main stem, just because that's going to help, that's going to help that not happen. If I wrap it around several times, first on the main stem, kind of cover over that tail a couple times, and then join in the new flower. Okay, so I'm going to floss down a couple inches here, because I want it to be really secure. I don't want this branch to start spinning around. So I'm going to floss down until it's secure, which I'm hoping will only take a few inches. But you also need to keep in mind how far you want your vine to stick out from your vase or from your pot. So if you want it to, if you need it to be a little bit taller, you'll need to wrap down a little bit further. All right, so I flossed down a couple of inches here. And I kind of give my branches a shake and make sure that nothing is spinning or moving out of place. If it is wobbling back and forth pretty badly, then you'll want to redo the assembly. So make sure that you're wrapping as tight as you can around those little branches. And if you need to, use that floral tape to bind them together first. Okay, so I've wrapped down a couple of inches here, and I'm ready to tie off my floss. I cut that short, and then I'm going to cover with floral tape, not all the way down to the end. If I'm putting it in a vase, I'm going to leave some little lengths unwrapped, but I just want to add a little bit extra security to my stems, so I'm going to cover with floral tape, and I also want to cover up all these little threads. So I'm going to cover with floral tape down a little ways. Now this stem I have trouble with because I assembled it and it was a little bit shorter the last time I assembled it, and all of my stems are already short because I trimmed it to that length, and for this one I needed them a little bit longer. You'll need the stems below to be about the depth of your vase or your pot. Now you can add extra length below if you need to with extra stem wires, just by kind of overlapping them and having them extend down the bottom. You can do that if you need to, if you didn't have enough length here. Alright, so I'm going to trim these ones to about right there. And then if I'm putting it in a vase, I'm going to bend these outward a little bit, just so that there's a little bit, there's kind of like a leg for my little arrangement to stand on. And one thing I'm going to do at this point is to do a little bit more shaping. So I'm going to kind of look over my vine, see if there's anything that I don't like about it. And I don't like that there's kind of a gap here. So I'm going to move this flower a little bit so it kind of covers that gap a little bit. And I need some leaves down this way, so I'm going to move those leaves down. I'm going to add some shaping to all of my little vines, because I don't really want it to be straight, so I'm going to add some bends to my vine, because it is a vine. It shouldn't be, stock straight. And let's see, let's kind of maybe add some more bends and curls. I'm gonna make sure that my leaves aren't all just branching off to the side. I kind of pulled this one forward so I would have some growth that direction, but I don't know if I like that or not. I might change it. Because this is made out of wire, you can change the shaping pretty much anytime you want to. So if you're ever walking past it later and say, I don't like that anymore, you can just change it, and it's going to be just fine to remold your branches. See, now I don't like that flower over there. That's kind of weird. So maybe I'll pull this one up a little bit more. And then pull these little leaf stems down. I feel like I have too many leaves right there. So maybe I'll go like this with my leaves. I think I like that a little bit better than what it was before, but I just want to show you that you can bend all your stuff around. You'll want to go back through and kind of give your leaves some shaping. I didn't shape my leaves quite as much as all of my petals, and that's why I didn't lace the larger ones. It's because I didn't really need to, because they weren't going to be as bendy as the little petals were going to be. But you'll still want to give them some kind of shaping so that they don't look flat. Curl them, bend them, kind of do this little shape. Do that over here. And you can even, these little things here don't need to stay straight, so you can kind of pull these down like that. I'm going to do that in a couple places because I don't really want that V shape everywhere. Kind of want them to extend a little bit more chaotically. Now you also want to make sure that your flowers are not all facing the exact same direction, because that's not how these vines grow. They don't all face towards you. So I'm going to put at least one flower kind of sideways, and then maybe one flower facing more forward, and maybe this one kind of partially sideways. And that gives me a variety of angles at which to view the flowers. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the way this vine looks here. We should fit on my screen a little bit better. And I'm ready to either put this in a vase or to pot it.